Welcome back, class. This is Chapter 8, Workplace Training. I'd like to start by talking about why we even spend some time on training in this class. So this is a human resource management class, managing human resources. Certainly, it's easy for me to answer why we would spend a significant amount of time on training. The most effective, most admired companies tend to train their employees extensively, so that some of the best companies, most of the best companies, use training extensively to maximize the effectiveness of their workforce. Second reason is my own reason that billions of dollars every year in the United States are wasted on training. So training that's not needed, training that's needed but ineffective in its delivery. Lots of ways to training that's good and needed, well done, but not supported pre and post after the employee returns to the workplace and is unable to apply that training to their job for various reasons. So a lot of money is wasted on training. So really, if you can learn some practices from this chapter on how to more effectively administer training, how to get more of your money's worth from training, this will be a big payoff throughout your career. So let's get started on that. I would like to start at the beginning, which is training needs assessment. Before you spend money on training or throw training at a problem, it's kind of important to understand what the needs are in your workplace. What does your workforce need in terms of development and skills that they don't already have? And for those developmental needs, which of those are amenable to training? In other words, which of those would training be effective at improving? So there is a process called training needs assessment, sometimes called training needs analysis, where you can study an employee's or an occupational group's needs in terms of training and precisely define those. So people have been doing this for quite a while, probably at least 50 years, if not more, in various fashions. So there's plenty of lessons learned out there. So if you want to maximize the value of your training budget, step one is to periodically assess the training needs of your employees. Make use of lessons learned. What are the best practices in training needs analysis? And rigorously assess those needs. If you don't have time to do that, you can also hire a consultant to do that for you. Be prepared to at least do enough research so you know the hard questions to ask the candidates before you award a contract to a consultant that maybe won't do a good job for you. So you want to know some basics about what rigorous, effective training needs analysis looks like. So that's step one. Analyze training needs and then try to meet those needs if training is the appropriate solution. I'd like to shift now to a topic called transfer of training. That's one of the biggest concepts in this chapter. And the reason is something that I mentioned earlier. So much training results in so little payback for the organization. There's so little return on investment from quite a bit of the training that's delivered in industry. So transfer of training is the term that will help you get more return on investment. And that the phrase simply means, to what extent are employees able to transfer what they learned from the training back to the job when they return to the workplace? So it's that big jump between what they learned, what was taught in the training, and what happens when they return to work. So really, I think that's something we want to focus on, and I'll talk a little bit more about transfer strategies in a moment. Probably one of the first questions we should address before conducting any training is training the solution? Often it's not. So I'm going to, in the course, introduce you to Pipe and Mager's work. These were two brilliant trainers that came up with this flow chart that we'll look through maybe one or two forms of this flow diagram that takes you from the initial performance discrepancy down to possible solutions. So keep an eye out for that chart. It will be either Mager and Pipe's initial flow chart or a derivation of that, maybe a more recent version of that. The beauty of this thing is it takes you through a logical process. So when we follow that flow chart, you'll notice that oftentimes the solution to a performance discrepancy is not training. What do I mean by performance discrepancy? That's kind of a fancy term for just a situation where employees are not doing as you would like them to. In other words, their performance is not what you had hoped for. So there's a discrepancy between desired performance and actual performance. That would be a performance discrepancy. So we'll try to get you to apply this flow diagram to a situation you've seen at work or you're constantly seeing where employees are not performing as desired, and see where that flow chart leads you in terms of a solution. What you'll notice is there's only one of those, a small number of outcomes that end up at training as a solution. So training is definitely a viable solution for some problems, but for a lot of other performance discrepancies, there's going to be better solutions than training. Now, if training is the answer to a performance discrepancy or an issue in the workplace, here is my take on that. Assume it's amazingly difficult to transfer trained knowledge to the job. Excuse me, let me repeat myself. I'd really like to be clear on this point. If training is the answer to a performance discrepancy you're witnessing at the workplace, assume that it's amazingly difficult to transfer trained knowledge to the job, and that it's important to do so. So I think that gets us in the right mindset that we need to assume that it will be hard for people to transfer what they learn back to the workplace because it often is, and then we need to facilitate that process. So we'll talk about some ways that you can rehearse that process. What are the things that can be done before somebody goes to training, during, and after? I'll take a look at a chart here for a moment. I'll put this up on the screen. It's a pretty simple chart. Sometimes I like these kind of metaphor visuals like this. And so this kind of shows the three main parties that would be involved to make that amazingly difficult process that is transferring what has been learned back to the job successfully. The three main parties that are involved in that. So it shows the trainee, the trainer, and the manager, the employee's supervisor, all have a role to play, and all will be necessary to play a role for that to be a success. All right, I also am going to share with you another document some way in this course. It's called Strategies for Transfer. This is not a particularly exciting looking document, but it's actually one of the most important documents we'll see in this course. This thing is full of ideas about how to maximize the effectiveness of training and ensure that what has been learned gets used on the job. So I would like you to look at this extensively and see which of those strategies before the training, during the training, and after the training makes sense to you. You can put on different mindsets when you look at that. If you were the boss that was going to send somebody to training and you're very conscious about wisely spending kind of a small training budget, which of those things would you be most likely to do because you think they would work well? You could also put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's been through training. So maybe you have been through corporate training of some sort, or maybe even just school. And what are some things that you think would have helped you as a trainee to get more value out of a training course that you attended? So look that over very carefully, please. I think if you will maintain in your head in the future as a boss or manager that there's a heck of a lot you can do that's going to get more payoff from training interventions, this document will help you quite a bit. Okay, I would like to shift gears just slightly to characteristics that distinguish companies with the most effective training practices. And one of the things mentioned is that top management is committed to training and development. I believe in that wholeheartedly. So employees do tend to emulate the higher level managers. not all employees, but a lot of employees to do, especially employees that are hoping to have some upward mobility. They will tend to observe what the high-level bosses do and emulate that for good or ill. And so if they pick up on a signal that a particular training and intervention or a course is important to the higher level and highest level managers, that sends a pretty strong signal. It's going to have some effects on the extent to which the lower level employees take the training seriously. So really, I think that's step one. It's going to be difficult to implement a successful training intervention unless you have a lot of ongoing visible support from top management. I have seen this firsthand and can vouch for its truth. I'll tell a quick story. I worked as a management trainer for Westinghouse for a while, and my boss had thought up a very interesting and effective, very comprehensive management training program. It was a self-study where I wrote the training modules that managers had to complete, and then they had to pass an exam over the content of these self-study modules to prove that they had reasonably mastered the knowledge in these management training modules. It was 31 modules in all. And my boss was pretty clever. He sold the general manager, in other words, the highest level manager at our division at Westinghouse, on the importance of the training program and also the importance of participating. So this was a general manager this was a nuclear site that I worked at, and this guy had a PhD. The general manager was a PhD in nuclear physics. He could have just said, forget this, I'm a general manager, I have a PhD, get out of here, I don't need to participate. That's good, you guys are doing that for the lower level people, but too busy. He didn't do that, fortunately. So our training facility was in a trailer. There were several buildings scattered around this nuclear site, but ours was in one of the trailers scattered around there. So this general manager would read through the training modules and then walk over to our trailer to take the exam. Ho-hum, right? So what? This is boring. Let me make my point here. What happened, people would see the general manager walking, they would see where the general manager went. Moreover, we would have oftentimes other first-line supervisors, lower-level supervisors and managers in the trailer. In comes the general manager, sits down and takes the exams to prove knowledge over this content, just like any other manager. Have you heard about symbolic actions or symbolic leadership? Symbolism, maybe you've heard that in an organizational behavior class or not, but a lot of times actions speak louder than words when it comes to leadership. That really helped us out as trainers. We had a 100% participation in our training program. It was very successful. All right, let me shift forward in time. That general manager was transferred to another facility. I think there was a promotion for him, and the number 2 assistant general manager moved up, another PhD in nuclear physics, became the general manager. This guy was a pretty good guy, well-intentioned, but didn't do like the first guy. So he kind of had intentions of finishing the management training program, but kind of got slower and slower in terms of completion. And then his secretary would call over and say, hey, Dr. Cox is done with that next manual and would like to take the exam over. Could you bring over an exam? And probably what we should have done, although different levels of authority and power, we didn't. Probably should have said it'd be better if he came over here. So anyway, we started taking exams over there. Pretty soon he quit taking exams. So there was no more of this leadership from the top, this high visibility, and our program started limping along at that point. It was still kind of working, but not near as good as it could before. So I guess just to get back to my original point is that top management support, commitment, and participation is essential. How top managers behave in training is quite important. There was like a technical class that we had at our nuclear site that had to be completed. I think it was orientation. So every so often you had to go back through and learn the new requirements on our site to be safe around radiation and all kinds of other regulations. And I think it was one of those training programs where the controller, the top finance manager at our site, this was when cell phones were pretty much brand new. And since this controller, I'm going to be a little sarcastic here, since she was so important, she kept popping up in the training to answer her cell phone and going out in the hall, and then popping back in after missing some of the content, and then hopping up again, checking the cell phone or answering it, and set a really bad example. So that I got to take my hat off to the training manager at that point. He stepped up and told her, I think it was after that training session was over, he said, no more cell phone, either come to the training without the cell phone or don't come to the training anymore. Now she had to do the training, it was required, and we tracked that stuff, so it was being rather assertive, not necessarily confrontational, but definitely setting appropriate limits. Who cares if the person hops up to answer the cell phone? Again, example setting. This was the highest level female manager in our division, and she was a role model for a lot of other employees. It doesn't matter what gender, just male or female, that's inappropriate behavior. Manager has to show that training and knowledge is important, and this wasn't a fluff course. This was very important information. Like most organizational training, companies tend not to train just for the heck of it. Okay, back to my point about top management participation. I'd like to give another example, not from my personal experience, maybe a little bit shorter example. DuPont. DuPont, the chemical company, has had a really excellent reputation for safety, and one of the keys to their excellent safety reputation is extensive training. And not just extensive training, it's the method that they use. So in the past, what they have done, in fact, do a quick segue here, DuPont's safety training materials were so effective that they even were able to sell those to other companies. So this is DuPont, a chemical company, not a management consulting firm. But what I'm saying is their safety training was so effective that in addition to making money from chemicals, they were able to make some incremental revenue by selling their safety training to other companies. And what they did was, it was kind of a cascading method that they used for training. The first people to complete safety training was the person at the top of the pyramid at DuPont. I don't know if it's president or CEO, whatever the title was. That person and his or her immediate direct reports, the topmost managers, would complete it. Then those managers would train the managers reporting to them. Not a trainer, not a safety trainer is conducting the training. The manager is conducting the safety training. So that content has to be mastered by these managers before. It's often said that if you really want to learn something, teach it. And there's some truth to that. So these managers had to master the content and then train the people under them. So it kept cascading down. That would go to the next layer of management who had just been trained, would train the people reporting to them, down, 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 until the whole organization was trained on this DuPont safety information. Highly effective result. Think about it. You're in a class. You know the CEO took this training and passed it, so it must be pretty darn important. Also, if my boss is conducting training, generally, unless this is a kind of a weird situation or a strange workplace, I'm going to pay pretty close attention to what my boss is doing. My boss determines my pay raise, my performance review. I got to see my boss regularly, plus my pride's at stake. I want to either be smart about what the boss is teaching or be able to pass any exams that are associated with. So I'm going to pay attention if my boss is conducting the training. So certainly wouldn't be an approach you'd use on everything, but when you really want something to cascade down and change the culture of an organization, that's one approach that can work. I'd like to talk a little bit about Pygmalion effect. It's a little bit difficult to say. Cassio talks about Pygmalion effect in the chapter. I think this is really important. And it's not just a training thing. So it is related to training, but it has broader management implications as well. The point I'd like to make is that your attitudes toward your employees can have large effects, very large effects. So I'm not talking about your behavior, toward employees, or what you say to employees, your attitude toward employees, that in and of itself can have big effects. Why? Because employees can sense that. So I think Cassio talks about it from a training perspective, that if you expect that trainees will perform at a high level, they're more likely to learn more and indeed perform at a high level. If you think that they're not going to be very good learners, that they're dumb, that they're not going to pick up on the training, that oftentimes is going to be exactly what happens. So people can pick up on these subtle, for some people it's not so subtle signals, but for most people that are discreet, you can still pick up on their attitudes toward you, even if they're non-overt about those attitudes. And the point is, employees tend to live up or down to your expectations. Low expectations, they'll live down to those oftentimes. If you have high expectations, even incredibly high expectations, a lot of times they will live up in terms of performance to those high expectations. So it's really important that you think about that related to training, and also just to yourself as a manager. It traces back to Douglas McGregor. There was an influential book, we may have talked about it before, from 1960 called The Human Side of Enterprise, and a lot of what he talks about in that book is how managers' assumptions about human beings or about people affect how they manage people, which has pretty big effects on outcomes and employee behavior. So that's why he had always pushed for theory Y assumptions, that people will be good workers, that you can trust people if you train them properly. Positive assumptions about people that lead to positive managerial behaviors, positive employee behaviors. All right, Cassio, I would like to quote him briefly. A new employee's experience during the initial period with an organization can have a major impact on his or her career. Consequently, during this period, an employee is more receptive to cues from the organizational environment than she or he is ever likely to be again. That's written a little bit academic, but we do look for cues, we do pick up on cues, and most employees will be quite receptive to cues during that initial socialization period. So I think that is, I like that Cassio included this in the chapter. I'd like for you to think about it and think about how that will affect your behavior as a manager with new employees, or with new, even not as a boss, with new coworkers. Because you'll have a stake in the success of new coworkers. If they're not socialized properly, it's just going to make your job tougher. So I really think that's important. Now, it's also important for the new employee to be proactive and be receptive to those cues. I know when I started to work here, and I'm certainly not a model employee, but one thing I am is kind of proactive about seeking information that will help me be more successful. So you may want to do that yourself, even as an individual contributor. When you take a new job or get a new boss or move to a new department, be proactive about information seeking and observing the customs and norms, and asking questions that will help you be more effective on the job. It's really important. But let's go back to the managerial implication of that. That is that managers should make the most of that early socialization period that new employees have. So orient the new employees, spend time with the new employees, make sure that the key messages that you want to get across are absorbed by the employee. I would also enlist your best employees in the socialization process. So you don't want the socialization to be done by some of your less effective or less motivated employees. You want your top-notch employees to be involved in that socialization and the norm setting process. Is that making sense? Norm setting, establishing desired behaviors. And then provide a lot of social support so that you reduce stress and you can keep that receptivity up. If I'm overloaded as a new employee where there's so much hitting me at once, I'm probably going to need some social support, some emotional support, some encouragement, and so that I can stay proactive in my information seeking, absorb all of this information that's hitting me. This kind of leads us to orientations. I think new employee orientations or orientations in general are worthwhile. The research literature supports that. They're going to have a positive payback, return on investment wise. They're going to generate revenue because they're going to help employees get up to speed more quickly, understand their role more quickly, reduce new employee stress. So they're definitely worth spending time on, even if you do an extensive orientation, which I tend to favor. I would pre-plan orientations. Don't try to do it on the fly when somebody shows up. Think it through. What are the things that the employee needs to know? Where's that information available? Who's the best person to provide that information? How can that information be spaced out appropriately? What does the person need to know first? What can they learn later? One of the common orientation don'ts or the mistakes to avoid is overloading the person with information the first day or two. So pre-plan these things so that you don't do that. Make use of best practices. There's probably hundreds of articles out there now, obviously some better than others, and on best practices in orientation. I know a lot of employers, sometimes this stuff seems a little trendy to me, but I think they call it onboarding now, which I think goes a little bit beyond orientation, but onboarding might be another source of literature to look to for best practices and getting new employees up to speed. So they're worthwhile. Switch gears again for a moment, talk a little bit about the use of exams. You guys probably will never want to see another exam when you finish school. Maybe you won't see another one outside of maybe the driver's license office or somewhere like that. But I think you may. I don't know. I know in the nuclear industry we had to use exams quite a bit. Why? You got to make sure people know how to work safely around nuclear energy. So that practice is ingrained in the nuclear culture, the use of exams to prove mastery of knowledge. I think I really hadn't encountered that much outside of that industry. I've worked in manufacturing as well. And but I have to say, I think use of exams can be effective. Would I use exams at the end of every training program? Certainly not. But I would consider it at least, even if it's an exam just for your own sake of the trainees or the trainers to assess what's been learned, and the score really doesn't count for anything other than self-knowledge or to gauge the effectiveness of the training. I would consider using exams, and especially for safety-related information. We need to make sure that employees understand how to work safely and avoid injuring others. So think about the use of exams as a way of assessing whether trainees have absorbed the knowledge they should have. And I think in some cases just knowing that there is an exam at the close of training tends to be encourage some trainees to take the training more seriously, so they'll get more out of it. On that note, taking training more seriously, I'd like to back up just a moment. The strategies for transfer. One strategy for transfer that I think is very important to ensure that training is maximized is to use the technique. Before a trainee goes to training, the boss can do a variety of things, but one of my favorites is to tell the trainee that, hey, this is important, here's why we're sending you. The person going really needs to understand why it's worthwhile. Otherwise, motivation to learn is low. And then the boss can always say, I want you to learn as much as you can, and when you get back, in fact, let's sit down now and set an appointment for after you get back when you and I can talk about what you learned. So that sends a pretty strong message that, hey, this is important. Boss wants me to learn something. Boss wants to know what I learned. So that's pretty powerful, and I think sometimes you can even ask the trainee, when you get back after we talk, I think it's probably going to be appropriate for you to share what you learn with the coworkers. So when you and I discuss what you learn, we'll talk about how we could have you conduct training or transfer that knowledge from your head on into these other employees so that we can get the most use out of your session. So I think that can be effective. I've always thought that was effective, and I had a student who was a coach actually in this class. He said that he was sent to, I think it was offensive line training, so it wasn't corporate training, but it was definitely training that had to be mastered, and something to do with football offense. And the head coach, before this other coach went, said, I want you to learn everything about this, and you're going to come back and teach me. And this coach said that he paid a heck of a lot more attention during the training, knowing he was going to have to go back to his boss and teach that boss on what was learned. So some of these techniques are pretty simple, but can have major effects on the return on investment from training. I think I'll close by talking about new supervisors. You guys seen new bosses promoted and then it's kind of sink or swim? It's kind of amazing how some people end up being supervisors. It's so important to pick the right person for supervisor, and it's so important to get that person trained to be supervisor, preferably. Almost never happens. We did it at Westinghouse, but I haven't seen it done too much elsewhere, training people how to be a supervisor before their boss. But certainly at the point they become a new boss, extensive training and development activities will be helpful. It's a pretty big leap. Even if you've worked for a lot of bosses and learned from them, even if you're technically the most knowledgeable and proficient individual contributor in the department, being boss is a lot tougher than it looks. So I just can't believe how many companies neglect this area of supervisor training. I'm a big believer in it. I think there's a heck of a lot of topics new supervisors need to know about. And in some cases they can be mentored, but I think a lot of it's just going to be based on good old management training. Multi-courses, multi-modules, however you want to refer to it. There's a lot of knowledge that needs to be mastered. It's a tough job being boss. Why do we have to have new bosses learn by making mistakes? It doesn't make sense to me. There's a lot of basic management 101 errors that bosses can avoid if they're taught about do's and don'ts for management. And when I say management 101, I don't mean dumb, simplistic stuff. Even smart, even PhDs have become administrators. There's just a lot to being bosses, a lot of ways to mess up. And if we can help new managers and supervisors avoid some of those issues, and I'm a strong believer that we can through management training, we should do that. So there's no need to learn every lesson the hard way, because a lot of these are predictable mistakes that a high proportion of new supervisors make. So I'm a big believer in new supervisor training. So if your company, if you're a new boss or a new manager, start talking to your company about some resources that you can get. Look out for yourself if they don't look out for you, because I think it'll be time well invested. You'll have an MBA, I hope, so you'll have a big advantage on this, but still, even an MBA is not going to cover everything you need to know as a new manager. So, and there's a lot of that management lore that you probably need to revisit, the common do's and don'ts, how to delegate, how to discipline, all those things. So we'll cover a lot of that in this class, but books are another alternative. There's some pretty good, hello, you're a new boss, here's some stuff to do and not to do, and I'm sure you could get access to some reader recommendations or some ratings of which of those books tend to be most effective. So, and certainly I would try to help you if you become a new manager or supervisor. I would try to assist you by pointing you toward resources and such. So think about that. And also, as a manager, you will be, hopefully you'll be hiring trainers to come train your employees on occasion. So you may be working with outside vendors, people that do training of various sorts. So use some of these principles. If I was going to bring training into my organization, I would do a little pre-work and have a lot of hard questions that I would be asking the trainer about the content. I would be expecting this training vendor to be talking to me about things like, can I come into your organization and talk to top management about their feelings about this training? So the vendor should be assessing the organizational culture, the extent to which the training will be supported by top management, whether the content fits key messages that managers want to get across. This vendor should be able to answer your questions about what they're going to do to maximize transfer. What are the things they're going to do before the training, during, and after, and what can you do in conjunction with this training vendor to maximize the effectiveness of the training. I would be highly skeptical of a training vendor, somebody trying to sell me training who didn't talk about transfer of training and things that could be done before, during, and after the course to maximize it. So be kind of a skeptical, prepared manager when you talk about hiring somebody to do training for you, and there you can have some pretty high expectations and push the trainer to provide more, and consider using RFPs or requests for proposals that force the training vendor to address some of these issues. How are you going to fit the training to the organizational culture here? What are you going to do, and what are you going to recommend we do before, during, and after the training to get maximum value out of the training? How are you going to assess trainee uptake of the training? Those would be things that I'd be pushing pretty hard on training vendors. All right, thank you. That should conclude